In this age of the instant expert, where we can tap into information into infinity, where artificial intelligence purports to know everything, there is one big question, one area of uncertainty, a question that keeps a lot of us up at night. It's a fundamental mystery of human existence. Something no one, not a single one of us, can truly know until it happens. And that is how, where, and when we are going to die. And for many, listening to true crime allows us to safely explore our curiosity about mortality. Though when it comes to our own death, we're bound to imagine an ideal scenario that when it happens, hopefully in the distant future, we'll die of natural causes, peacefully, God willing, in our sleep. And we imagine the people remembering us will be family and friends, those closest to us writing the obituary, recapping our greatest hits in a eulogy, our memories kept alive in the hearts and minds of those who loved us. What more, really, could a person ask for? Then there are the unfortunate few, those who harbor a creeping suspicion that their death is just around the corner. Their impending demise, anything but natural. And if their grim prediction comes true, and they do meet an unnatural and untimely end, it's about more than being remembered. It's making sure the truth gets told. And a eulogy won't cut the mustard. They'll need Dateline to dig into their story. And with all due respect to Josh and Dennis and Andrea, everybody knows, if you're hoping a Dateline episode will do you justice, there's only one man to call. Dial M for Morrison. Keith Morrison, Dateline correspondent extraordinaire. Such were the circumstances of a Georgia man everyone called Big Daddy, a larger-than-life lawyer who confided in a colleague that he worried someone was out to kill him. He didn't have enough evidence to go to the police, but he had a theory, one that he shared with his colleague, that he asked her to share with Dateline, if needed, in due time. He was half kidding, of course. Ha ha. But it wasn't so funny when Big Daddy disappeared in the summer of 2018. And indeed, it would be up to the biggest name in true crime, Keith Morrison, of Dateline, to get to the bottom of what happened to Big Daddy. And you'll hear all about it and much more in this episode of Dead Sleep, True Crime for Bedtime. I'm Nancy Miller, the creator and host of the podcast. And please join me as we celebrate the birthday month of Keith Morrison. The true crime icon just turned 78 years old. And for the month of July, we will be revisiting some of Keith Morrison's best stories and career highlights. Of course, this being Dead Sleep, this episode will have plenty of little sidebars and segues to fatigue one's busy mind, without any gory bits or screaming 911 calls, or no loud obnoxious ads to blast you awake. Dead Sleep is forever independent and ad-free. This show relies on you, the listener, to exist. So if you love the show, feel free to support it by becoming a paid subscriber via Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Patreon. And please, I strongly encourage you to enjoy a free month on Apple Podcasts, a free 7-day trial on Patreon. Try before you buy. Now, I chose this Dateline episode, which aired earlier this year, because this case is what Keith Morrison referred to as the perfect Agatha Christie mystery. One that takes place in a remote and contained space. A sprawling property in suburban Georgia. When a wealthy and powerful patriarch turns up dead. And it's the people closest to him, members of his own family, who become the prime suspects. Assuming, of course, the man was murdered in the first place. Which wasn't clear in July of 2018, when Gary Ferris first went missing. Gary Ferris wasn't one to blend in. There was his size. Gary was a big man, a towering 6'5" and weighed about 300 pounds, with a booming voice and a sizable intellect, which served him well as an attorney, and a big laugh, which served him well as a father of 4 who'd been married to his teenage sweetheart for nearly 39 years. His wife, Melody, was a petite woman who practically needed a stepladder to give her husband a peck on the cheek. But even bigger than all of that was Gary's magnanimity, his generous nature. In 2018, Gary was 58 years old, and though his children were now all grown, some with children of their own, Gary still stood strong in that family, like a sturdy Georgia oak tree, and protected them like one too. When his children needed anything, especially cash, Gary always had plenty of green. Some wondered, including his own wife Melody, if Gary offered the children too much cover. Especially his 2 grown sons, now in their 30s, Chris and Scott. But Gary Ferris didn't appear to mind, which is why those closest to him, especially in the rural suburb about 30 minutes outside of Atlanta, an area called Alpharetta, most knew him as more than Gary. He was known as Big Daddy. With such a big presence, of course, his absence would be noticed. One of the first to notice was his oldest son, Chris, who came to the property early July 4th with his 2 daughters. And as the girls scurried around in search of their grandpa, they were disappointed that the man that they saw as a gentle giant didn't appear to be around. Then again, this was a generously sized property, a 10-acre patch of land with chickens and goats and horses, vegetable garden and a giant barn, and just off of that, a dense tangle of woods. All of it maintained by Big Daddy and his second eldest son, Scott, doing the heavy lifting. The family called the property the farm, and Big Daddy, with his farmhand son, Scott, kept the property meticulously maintained. And Big Daddy was big on making sure all the underbrush, sticks, fallen branches, and other debris were routinely cleared, collected, and placed into a cleaning area they called the burn pile, a task that would be of great importance over the 4th of July holiday. Fireworks were a big deal around these parts, and one couldn't risk a little firecracker triggering a giant flame. Big Daddy loved to stack all of that stuff into a giant pile, like a Guy Fawkes pile, and watch it burn. In anticipation of 4th of July, Big Daddy started a burn pile the day before. That's July 3rd in the afternoon. One so large it continued to burn into the evening. Melody would later remember Big Daddy going to check on that fire sometime after dinner. And his son Scott, the farmhand, saw the smoke rising from that burning pile well into the evening when he came home later that night. But July 4th was a flurry of activity, of everybody in all different places, and it wasn't until the next day, that's the 5th of July, when Scott left his apartment atop the barn and was intercepted by his mother Melody, who asked if he knew where Big Daddy was. Concerned, he began to search for his dad. Along with the 10 acres of land on the farm, there was the main house. This house, of course, was big, bought just for Melody. A thank you gift, it seems, from her adoring husband. Indeed, all of this whole property, the whole move from Atlanta to Alpharetta, it was all for Melody. She'd earned it. Big Daddy's adult sons, Scott and Chris, may have still acted like children sometimes, but his wife Melody, she had grown up real fast. When she met and married Big Daddy, back when he was just a sprig, they were 2 teenagers who got hitched and had their firstborn while they were practically children themselves. Melody had been a stay-at-home mom her entire life, raising a total of 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls. All throughout her 20s and 30s, she stayed home, supported Gary as he put himself through law school and became a successful real estate attorney in Atlanta, an area that would enjoy a robust real estate boom throughout the 1990s and early 2000s that would make a career in real estate for Big Daddy a lucrative occupation. Now it seemed it was Melody's turn. Payback for all those years as a dutiful wife and mother. And though the two shared the house, it wasn't uncommon for them to not see each other for long stretches of time. With Melody and Big Daddy basically having their own living quarters. Like many couples who'd been married for nearly 40 years, Melody and Big Daddy, they slept in separate bedrooms. For Melody, it was a luxury and a necessity. Big Daddy was a big snorer, and he suffered from a severe case of sleep apnea, one that was serious enough that it required a CPAP machine. CPAP stands for Continuous Positive Airway Pressure, and the machine itself can even be louder than snoring. So, at one point, Big Daddy moved down to the finished basement, and that's where he spent most of his nights. But when they looked for Big Daddy there, he wasn't in the house or in the basement. Now this was a full Ferris family manhunt, with Melody and Scott and Chris and the other kids all looking for Big Daddy, who was still MIA that day, July 5th. Of chief concern was that recently Big Daddy had been complaining of having what he called spells. Moments where he felt lightheaded and weak. And now everyone worried. What if he'd had one of his spells and was collapsed somewhere in the woods? The property was big enough that they had cameras installed, like trail cameras that captured the comings and goings, for security, really. And when son Scott checked the cameras, he said there was nothing on them. Just critters, he'd later say, going about their day. Then Scott remembered the burn pile. Those plumes of smoke that he'd seen July 3rd, that evening when he came home late. Gravely concerned, Scott made his way to his father's last known whereabouts. That burn pile, which was now just a giant mound of smoldering ashes and debris. But Big Daddy was nowhere to be found. By then, Scott was joined by his brother, Chris, and both men wondered maybe that their father was at work. He was a partner in a law firm, and for as long as they could remember, he worked all the time. Even as kids, Scott remembered their family vacations. They were really more business trips, places his father had to visit for work, that they'd passed off as family time. Orlando, for instance, was only 6 hours away from Atlanta by car, or an hour's flight, and yet Scott and his siblings had never been to Disney World. Not that he was bitter. Now that he was an adult, things had changed. Scott was now his dad's right-hand man. And he imagined one day he'd be handpicked by his father to take over the farm. For now, the big question was, where was Big Daddy? Scott cautiously looked over the burn pile. A horrible thought, but just in case. And he was relieved to see that the burn was clean. No sign of an accident. There were just some bits and pieces like pebbles and rocks and... Wait. What was that? He spotted a round, shell-like piece of something. Gray. Not a rock. Scott needed a closer look, so he reached into the ash and grabbed the object with his bare hand. Scott had been in the military, and he'd served in Iraq. He'd seen some stuff. But this... He turned it around, and that's when he realized, oh dear God, a cold shiver of sheer terror going down his spine. It was a portion of a human skull, and it was, no doubt about it, it had to be his father. What was left of him anyway. Scott and Chris ran to the house, and they called the police. A man found dead on his own burn pile. Well, it wouldn't have been the first time this happened in this particular county. But it was the first time that authorities had seen someone so consumed by the flames. There was barely anything left. But as they spoke with the family and got a sense of who Gary was, it was fair to say he might have had it coming. You see, Big Daddy was a stand-up guy who everyone relied on, which seemed to lead Big Daddy to believe he was superhuman, invincible. Big Daddy ate whatever he wanted, in every amount he wanted, never did a lick of exercise, and smoked 2 packs of cigarettes a day. When he was eventually prescribed blood pressure medication, he washed the pills down with giant swigs of a neon green-colored, sugar-laden soda pop called Mountain Dew. It was the only mountain Big Daddy liked to climb. He was known to drink a 12-pack of the stuff every single day. So maybe he'd exerted himself when, after dinner, he'd made his way down to that burn pile. He likely suffered a cardiac event, and then he keeled over. All 6'5" of him, the mighty oak, devoured by all those flames. The only saving grace, everyone hoped, was that Big Daddy's heart had stopped before he hit the burn pile and didn't feel a thing. Now, all of this was assuming that it was indeed Gary Ferris's remains. No one would know for certain, until they sent them off to a lab to be tested and be 100% sure. But for now, they sifted through what was left, including a portion of poor Big Daddy's rib cage. In one of the investigators' keen eyes noticed a little fragment, a silver nub lodged in between two of his ribs. And that's when they realized that was a single bullet. Big Daddy hadn't died of natural causes. Big Daddy had been shot. And with that, the death of Gary Ferris was officially ruled a homicide. And county authorities, who rarely had a murder on the books, they launched a full investigation, where they quickly discover they had a scant amount of evidence. The list of what they didn't have was longer than what they did have. They didn't have a body. Not really. Which meant they were missing crucial pieces of information to build a murder case. Without a body, how would they determine where he was shot and when he was killed? They didn't have a murder weapon. The gun used appeared to be a .38. But where was it? And more important, who pulled the trigger? A search of the property, it took time, but it did lead to a few more clues and one stunning revelation. Another bullet found in Big Daddy's basement bedroom, with some artful splashing of the chemical compound luminol revealing bloodstains, a glow of smears, suggesting he was killed here at the house in that basement, then somehow maneuvered from the home to that burn pile, someone hurling his hulking frame into those scorching flames, then whoever killed him doing their best to clean up the evidence, but their best wasn't good enough. Which meant early on, Petite Melody was off their suspect list. There was no way his wife, who was at least a foot shorter than her husband and roughly a third of his body weight, could have hauled Big Daddy that distance and hoisted him into a burn pile. Not possible. Which left older brother Chris and younger brother Scott, both of the brothers, Chris and Scott, have relied on Big Daddy for cash infusions over the years. But detectives would soon learn these men weren't Boy Scouts, and what Daddy didn't give, they appeared to take. Eldest brother Chris, in particular, had helped himself to Daddy's checkbook one day and had consistently used Daddy's resources to pay things like rent, bills, the essentials that one would have hoped, with all of Chris's opportunities, he could have done for himself, providing for his family. And detectives would also learn that Scott's relationship with his father, it wasn't all chummy as he claimed it to be. According to Melody, they fought constantly, and their arguments sometimes came to blows. Was it a coincidence that they'd both come upon their father's remains in that burn pile together? But police questioned Chris intensely and ultimately decided that he had nothing to do with this. So they turned their attention to Scott, whose behavior before and after his father's death was peculiar, to say the least. He was the only one around on July 3rd when he came home late in the evening, long after Melody said she'd gone to bed. Scott said he hadn't seen his father, only the smoke from the burn pile. But was it really possible he wouldn't have seen his father from his apartment over the barn? Scott told police he'd checked those trail cameras the ones where he claimed just captured a few critters and nothing else. But when they asked Scott to share the footage, he revealed to the cops he deleted it. A search of his apartment, the one above the barn, was even more incriminating. Somewhere in the clutter, authorities found bullets. Loose bullets, just like the ones used to kill his father, rattling around in one of Scott's drawers. When confronted, Scott sounded like a busted teenager. He swore those bullets weren't his. They belonged to his friends who came over to their property to do some shooting just for fun. They must have left them behind. They weren't his. It was hard to know what was up with Scott. Was he just clueless? Or a killer? It turned out Melody, his mother, believed her son was possibly dangerous. She'd shared with a friend how Scott frightened her, that he had anger issues, and he yelled at her, and it appeared he'd already assumed command over the farm, at least having a sense of entitlement that would all one day be his father's land, his father's fortune, his father's legacy. But this was now an estate matter. The answer to where Big Daddy's allegiances really lay would be revealed with his last will and testament. Except there was no such document. It appeared Big Daddy's will went up in smoke, if it existed at all, because nobody could find it. And Melody said she knew nothing about any will. She ran the household, but he handled all of the money. All of it. Without a will, the estate under Georgia law would automatically go to the spouse. That's Melody. Which some feared put Melody in greater jeopardy. With Big Daddy dead, what else was Scott potentially capable of? It would take time for detectives to make sense of it all, both the crime and the culprits. When authorities, however, talked to Scott, he pinned the blame on his mother. He swore that she was the one, he hated to say, who had it out for his father. He couldn't count the number of times where Melody complained about Big Daddy, how she hoped that he'd one day turn up dead. Chris supported his brother's claim that it was possible, even probable, that it was their mother who killed their father. And he said just before his own father died, he'd said he'd worried that Melanie was maybe trying to poison him, which is why he seemed so lethargic. Of course, that would be impossible to know. There wasn't enough of Big Daddy left to find out. The family was divided, with another child, one of their daughters, aligning with Melody, swearing that it wasn't possible her mother did this. Of course, Melody denied all of this. She'd said she and Big Daddy had a perfectly fine marriage. In fact, she'd gotten a little tattoo in his honor. XO. It meant hugs and kisses. Would that be a gesture of a woman who hated her husband? With a family this broken, it would take some time for detectives to put all the pieces together about who really killed Big Daddy. Was it Scott, the bad seed? Or Melody, the grieving widow? Now, it's unlikely that Keith Morrison knew much about this case in July of 2018. He doesn't find the Dateline stories. A talented team of producers do. And one of the reasons Dateline is so good is because they follow a case from start to finish, from the point of arrest to the verdict. And this case had a long way to go. But even if Keith had an inkling about who did it back then, this case wouldn't have been top of mind. because soon after Big Daddy was found in that burn pile, Keith would learn the life of someone he knew and loved had gone up in flames. Wait a second. Dateline's reliable, omniscient narrator, Keith Morrison, he has family drama? To quote the immortal words of convicted killer and famous Dateline imposter Pam Hupp, whoa, 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 whoa. But it's true. In July of 2018, Keith learned his famous and famously troubled stepson, Matthew Perry, was in the hospital, in a coma, and close to death. Of course, Keith loved his stepson, but the dynamic between the two was hard to define. And to be clear, I'm extrapolating from Keith Morrison's interviews and Matthew Perry's memoir to cobble together an impression. And I think the best metaphor to describe their relationship is by using the solar system. Keith and Matthew Perry weren't so much stepfather and stepson, as they were more like two planets that orbited around one giant star that burned warm and bright as the sun, the center of their universe. Keith's wife and Matthew's mother, Suzanne. Both men lived for Suzanne and competed for her attention. At least that's how Matthew Perry saw it. And Keith would later note how close mother and son were. But the intensity between mother and son, Matthew and Suzanne, it was hard for anyone else to understand. Like Melody, actually, Suzanne also married young. She was barely 19 when she married Matthew Perry's father. By 20, she had a newborn baby, and soon she'd be freshly divorced. For a decade or so, it was just Suzanne and Matthew. And then, in 1981, Suzanne married handsome newsman Keith Morrison. And 10-year-old Matthew Perry wasn't happy about it. Nothing personal. He just didn't want him marrying his mom. Now, Matthew Perry describes Keith Morrison as a perfectly lovely man. But the truth was, for as long as Matthew Perry could remember, the desire for his mother's attention was boundless. In all those years, Matthew Perry did drugs. He wasn't even trying to get high. He was just trying to fill the hole. And now the literal physical consequences of trying to fill that hole created a terrible injury, a blockage in his lower intestine, one that would require multiple surgeries, long hospital stays, and months, maybe years, of deep discomfort in his own body. And with those severe injuries came a deeply uncomfortable question, one that every parent asks themselves as their child grows up. What is the fine line or the third rail of when you help a child and when you hold them back? Of wondering if you did too little or did too much. In an interview, Keith himself said he didn't know what that balance was, that it was tricky. In the case of Big Daddy, his generosity led to his children taking advantage of him. There was a feckless greed in all of his family members, with deadly consequences. As for Matthew Perry, he knew too much was never enough. Matthew would eventually wake up from that coma, but he would never step out of what his life became, a living nightmare. One that would come to an abrupt end in 2023 when he began taking ketamine to treat his depression. Keith Morrison would later recall how Matthew truly believed ketamine was a miracle drug. That is until late October in 2023, when he was given a series of ketamine injections that led to a fatal overdose. It was a death that shocked everyone, but surprised few. Matthew Perry never wanted to die, but he came precariously close so many times. Those who loved him braced themselves for this kind of news. And a lot like Big Daddy, Matthew Perry's death initially was seen as an unfortunate accident, though in time, authorities would realize there was much more to that tragedy. Meanwhile, back in Georgia, the investigation into the murder of Gary Ferris was itself a Ferris wheel, a slow grind, an interminable loop, with accusations swirling and suspects talking in circles. Then one day, the wild ride abruptly stopped. And it wasn't Gary's son in the hot seat. It was Melody, Big Daddy's little missus. By then, authorities had determined those remains were indeed Big Daddy's, and the discovery of 2 bullets, one lodged in Big Daddy's ribcage and the other found in the house, meant he'd been shot twice and hit once. Blood evidence found in the home suggested an altercation, one that started in the kitchen, where that first shot was fired, hitting Big Daddy in the ribcage. Then the gun was fired again, as Big Daddy made his way to the basement. That bullet missed Big Daddy, but his bullet wound proved fatal. So that's how it happened. But how they knew it was Melody, that answer didn't come from a deadly weapon. They hadn't found the gun, but instead a life-saving device, that CPAP machine, the one Big Daddy used for his sleep apnea. It turned out CPAPs were a lot like Fitbits, devices that tracked user data, such as when the device was used. In Big Daddy's case, investigators found he used that CPAP device around the same time every night, when he went to bed, sometime between the hours of 11 p.m. and 1 a.m., and he did indeed use it every night, except for that night of July 3rd. He appeared to go silent somewhere around 9 o'clock p.m. After that, no texts, no calls, no movement. Meanwhile, investigators noticed Melody's phone activity was nonstop, always in motion. And it wasn't just her feet moving. She was in constant contact with someone, texting, talking with a man, it turned out, that Melody had been having an affair with for a long while. Months, years, long enough that she had a secret tattoo etched on her body in this man's honor. Just 2 letters, XO. At first, she told police it meant hugs and kisses, and Big Daddy loved it. But in truth, XO was a nod to the special brand of drink she and her paramour shared, likely the cognac Courvoisier XO. The XO, in this case, is a French abbreviation that means extra old or beyond age. It was a love affair that Big Daddy wanted to come to an end. When he'd found out about his wife's indiscretions, he cut Melody off financially, removing her name from all of his bank accounts, getting rid of her credit cards, and doling out small amounts of money to Melody like a child with an allowance. For Melody, it seemed unbearable. that Big Daddy was a spendthrift with his children, but tight-fisted with his own wife. Divorce, it seemed, wasn't the answer. The only way Melody could have it all, the money, her man, and her little patch of perfect, Big Daddy had to go. And this attempt, it seems, might not have been her first try. Melody's initial method of getting Big Daddy's dough was allegedly through the use of cookie dough. According to one of Gary's legal colleagues, Big Daddy said he believed Melody might have been trying to kill him by putting some kind of poison in a fresh batch of chocolate chip cookies. Big Daddy wasn't big on doctors, so he never got any blood work or had his theory checked out. He just told his legal assistant to remember that detail, just in case one day Dateline did indeed come knocking, which of course it did. Now, Dateline, it has resources to follow cases for as long as it takes. And that's a good thing too, because this case took a long time to go to trial. Melody, out on bond for years, had basically forged a new life for herself, living with her not-so-secret boyfriend in Tennessee. In 2024, the case went to trial, and everyone knew this case was anything but airtight. One glaring question was how little Melody was able to move her husband from the house to that burn pit. Well, it was a farm, and authorities basically claim that Melody moved Big Daddy like he was a giant bale of hay, somehow getting him onto a tractor and hauled him to that infernal fire pit. Tread marks from the wheels of the tractor near the fire pit supported that claim. Still, their biggest hole was bullet-sized. They still hadn't found the gun used to kill Gary Ferris. And it was in court, near the bitter end of this trial, when the Agatha Christie mystery turned into what Keith called a Perry Mason moment, a twist that would give this wild Ferris wheel one last turn. It's a longer story, but the gun apparently belonged to one of Melody's elderly relatives, and this relative, as old as she was, turned out to be a key witness in the 11th hour. Her testimony tipped the scales, and in the end, the jury found Melody guilty in the murder of Gary Ferris. Now, in front of the judge, Melanie swore she wasn't capable of throwing her husband on a burn pile, but she proved adept at throwing her son Scott under the bus, insisting he was the one who killed Big Daddy. She basically tried to relitigate her whole case right there in front of the judge during her sentencing, but it proved no use. Melody Ferris was sentenced to life in prison plus 5 years, which means she'll probably never see her little patch of perfect ever again. For the Ferris family, the image of little Melody heading to the big house, well, that made for a picture-perfect ending. But in Keith Morrison's own life, the life of his wife Suzanne, and the death of her son Matthew Perry, there was still a lot of work to do. And Matthew Perry's story will never be an episode of Dateline, obviously, but there was some justice at the end. During an investigation, it was uncovered that Matthew Perry was being ruthlessly exploited by medical professionals who were hired to help him. 3 out of the 4 people involved were held legally accountable for their actions. And there is one person allegedly involved, a woman known as the Ketamine Queen, who is scheduled to stand trial in August of 2025. That's about a month away. And you'll probably hear more about it on the true crime circuit. As for Keith Morrison, I was wondering after the death of Matthew Perry if Keith Morrison had had enough, that maybe he was tired of all of this and was ready to retire. But thankfully, it seems like he hasn't grown tired of this yet. As for us, I hope we've all grown tired as we come to the end of this episode. Thank you, as always, for listening and supporting Dead Sleep True Crime for Bedtime. I'll be back next week with another installment of our month of Keith Morrison. Oh, and in a few days, I will be releasing the 6th and final installment of this Dead Sleep Naked series. That's hand-picked episodes of Dead Sleep minus the music and sound effects. And I'm just figuring out what I want that final episode to be. So be sure to subscribe now so you don't miss it. Until then, nighty-night.